The mansion loomed against the morning
Ah,
sky, its tall white pillars catching the first light of dawn. To the world outside, it was a palace of endless wealth, its walls echoing with
ah,
success, its gardens carved to perfection, fountains leaping in graceful arcs as if money itself had shaped them. But inside, beneath the polished chandeliers and golden frames, silence ruled like a king. Silence so heavy, it clung to the air. Silence so sharp, it pierced even the strongest heart. That silence belonged to a father and his only son. The father, a man whose name carried power in business halls and financial districts, could command markets with a single word. He could build skyscrapers, buy out competitors, and expand empires. But within his own home, he was powerless. His son Samuel had never taken a single step. Born into riches that promised him the world, the boy had never run across the garden, never chased a ball, never wrapped his arms around his father while standing tall. From the day he was born, doctors had spoken with pity. Your son may never walk, they said. And for years, every attempt, every treatment, every machine, every therapist ended the same, in failure. The boy grew up surrounded not by laughter, but by routines of disappointment. Therapists came and went, each with confident promises that eventually dissolved into sighs and shaking heads. Machines filled his childhood more than toys did. Charts replaced bedtime stories. His legs stayed heavy, his body uncooperative. And slowly, hope in the house thinned until it was nothing more than smoke slipping through tired fingers. Before we go any further, if this is your first time watching one of our videos, we'd love for you to hit that subscribe button. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us bring you even more powerful stories. Stick with us till the very end. And if the story moves you, drop your thoughts in the comments and share it with a friend. Now let's begin. Samuel spent most of his days near the wide windows of the mansion. He would sit in his wheelchair, eyes fixed on the world beyond the iron gates. He watched children his age chasing each other, their laughter carrying through the air like music. Sometimes he smiled softly, but often his gaze dimmed with a sadness no child should know. He had every toy, every gadget, every luxury wealth could offer, but none of it mattered. He longed only for one thing: freedom. The simple freedom to stand, to walk, to live without limits. His father, Mr. Alden, buried himself in work. It was easier to face the noise of boardrooms than the silence of his own home. He arrived late, left early, his heart hardened by grief he could not admit. The mansion became less of a home and more of a monument to sorrow. Then one day, everything began to change. The house had hired a new maid. She was unlike anyone else who had ever walked through those gilded doors. Her name was Lila. She was young, but her eyes carried wisdom carved by struggle. She was black, from a world far different than polished marble floors and crystal chandeliers. She had known hunger, long nights, and hard work. Yet when she stepped into the mansion, she brought no heaviness with her. Instead, she carried something rare, something priceless: warmth. From the moment she entered, her presence felt different. Most of the staff moved like shadows, quiet and efficient, careful never to disturb Samuel. But Lila didn't treat him like fragile glass. The first time she saw him, he was sitting by the window, a book balanced on his small lap. She didn't lower her voice. She didn't let pity drip from her words. She simply smiled, bright and genuine, as if she had just met a new friend. "Hello, Samuel," she said, her voice soft but steady. "That's a big book you've got there. You must be very smart." Samuel blinked in surprise. People usually whispered around him. Or worse, they spoke to him with tones soaked in sorrow. But Lila's words carried no pity, no hesitation. She didn't look at his legs. She looked straight into his eyes. For the boy who had grown used to being seen as broken, that moment was small but extraordinary. Something stirred inside him, something that had been asleep for far too long. Over the days that followed, Lila worked with the grace of someone used to carrying heavy loads, both seen and unseen. She cleaned, polished, and cooked. But no matter how busy she was, she always found time to sit with Samuel. She told him stories of her childhood in the village, where the sun burned bright and games filled the fields. She described running barefoot on dirt roads, climbing mango trees, falling and standing again with scraped knees and laughter. Samuel listened, his eyes wide, his heart pulling toward the life he had never known. And when Lila laughed, oh, how she laughed, it filled the room with light. Her laughter was not careful or restrained. It was alive, spilling into the air like music. The silence that had once haunted the mansion began to crack, replaced by something the walls hadn't known in years. Joy. One afternoon, Lila entered the living room, carrying a small tray of fruit. Samuel, as always, sat staring out the window. His face was calm but distant, his mind lost in the sight of children chasing one another down the street. Lila placed the tray gently on the table, then sat beside him without asking permission. "What are you looking at?" she asked warmly. Samuel's voice came out barely above a whisper. "The kids." Lila followed his gaze. She saw them, their feet pounding on the pavement, their laughter echoing in the air. Instead of sighing or offering pity, she smiled. "They run fast, don't they? But you know what? Speed isn't everything. Sometimes the ones who move slow notice the most beautiful things." Samuel turned to her, puzzled. Nobody had ever told him something like that. "You see," she continued gently, "life isn't just about running. It's about living. And you, Samuel, you notice things most people don't. That's a gift." A warmth spread across Samuel's chest. For the first time in his young life, someone wasn't focusing on what he couldn't do, but on what he could. From that day forward, Samuel began waiting for Lila. The sound of her footsteps in the hallway became the sound of hope. She teased him, encouraged him, made him laugh, and treated him not as a patient, but as a boy with dreams. Mr. Alden, standing in doorways and watching quietly, felt something strange stirring in his heart. Curiosity. For years he had seen the world's best doctors fail. He had seen therapists give up. But now this woman, this maid with no title, no medical degree, no wealth, was reaching his son in ways no one ever had. And then came the moment that changed everything. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of cautious hope. The mansion, once a place of silent mourning, now stirred with the echoes of possibility. The boy, whose world had been confined to wheelchairs and whispered reassurances, began to look at his surroundings with different eyes. For the first time, he noticed the way the sunlight poured through the arched windows, painting golden trails across the marble floor. He saw the birds gather at the fountain, fluttering freely as though mocking his stillness, and yet he no longer felt envy. Instead, he felt a stirring, a restlessness, as though his body was beginning to remember something it had long forgotten. His father, a man whose wealth stretched beyond measure, had grown accustomed to seeking solutions through money. Every specialist, every piece of equipment, every possibility that promised even the faintest glimmer of hope had been purchased, brought into their world, and then discarded when it failed. But what he had never been able to buy was what now unfolded before him in the simplest of ways. A bond between his son and a woman the world would have overlooked. The maid carried with her no medical degree, no specialized training, no elaborate theories. She carried only a quiet strength, a patience that seemed infinite, and a faith that life had more to offer than the limits people set upon themselves. Her steps were light, her laughter a melody that drifted into corners of the house long left untouched by joy. When she moved about her work, she did so with dignity, never hurried, never careless, and always with a sense of purpose that made even the mundane appear sacred. It was during one of those afternoons, while the boy sat by the wide French doors that opened onto the garden, that she approached him with something different. In her hands, she carried not the usual tray of tea or folded linens, but a small potted plant, its leaves a vibrant green, its roots still fresh with soil. She placed it gently on the low table beside him. "Every living thing needs a reason to grow," she said softly, her accent curling around her words like poetry. "This one will need water, light, and care. But most of all, it will need hope." The boy tilted his head, his hands twitching slightly on the armrests of his chair. His eyes lingered on the plant, then shifted toward her. "What if it dies?" His voice carried the weight of years of disappointment, of endless attempts that led only to failure. She smiled gently, her eyes meeting his with unshakable calm. "Then we plant another, and another, until one lives. Because life does not stop at failure, child. It begins again." every day. He looked at her as though seeing her for the first time. No one had ever spoken to him like that, not as a fragile patient or a burden to be carried, but as a person capable of beginning again. Something within him stirred, fragile yet fierce, a spark that refused to be ignored. From that day forward, their afternoons were no longer filled with silence. The maid introduced him to small rituals, watering the plant, tracing its growth, talking to it as though it were listening. She told him stories of her own life, of struggles endured and battles fought, not with wealth or status, but with resilience and faith. The boy listened, his eyes wide, his heart slowly learning to believe in something more than despair. One evening, as the sky bled into shades of crimson and violet, the boy's father entered the room. He stood in the doorway, unseen for a moment, watching as his son leaned forward in his chair, reaching out with trembling fingers to touch the new leaves sprouting from the plant. His movement was awkward, strained, but it was more than he had attempted in months. And beside him, the maid knelt patiently, her hand hovering just close enough to steady him if he faltered, but not so close as to rob him of the triumph of trying. The father's throat tightened. For years he had thrown fortunes into solutions that promised miracles, and yet none had delivered what he now witnessed, his son daring to believe he could move. It was not science or surgery or equipment that had brought this about. It was hope, gently planted and tenderly watered by someone who had no reason to care, and yet chose to. Days stretched into weeks, and the boy's progress, though slow, began to show. His fingers grew steadier, his arms stronger. There were moments when he managed to shift himself slightly in his chair, his legs twitching with effort as though awakening from a long slumber. Each small victory was met not with overwhelming praise or suffocating concern, but with the maid's quiet encouragement. "Again," she would whisper, her voice both soft and firm. "One more time." And so he did. Again and again. It was not without setbacks. There were days when his body betrayed him, when exhaustion weighed him down, when tears of frustration blurred his vision. On those days, the boy would retreat into silence, his despair threatening to undo the progress he had made. But the maid never left him in that silence. She stayed near, sometimes speaking, sometimes not, but always present, always reminding him that failure was not the end. One night after a particularly difficult day, the boy broke down completely. His sobs shook his frail body as he cried out, "Why try if I'll only fail? Why hope if nothing ever changes?" His father, standing helpless at the doorway, felt his heart crack under the weight of those words. He wanted to rush in, to console, to promise his son the world. But he had learned that money could not mend a broken spirit. The maid, however, moved closer. She knelt before the boy, her hands resting gently on his knees. Her eyes, dark and steady, held his gaze. "Do you know why children fall when they learn to walk?" she asked. He shook his head through his tears. "Because their legs are weak, because their bodies are still learning. But do you know why they get up again?" His sobs quieted, curiosity fighting with despair. "Why?" "Because they have not yet learned the lie that failure is final." Her voice was fierce now, carrying a strength that seemed to reach into the marrow of his bones. "You are stronger than you believe, and every time you fall, you rise. That is not failure. That is life." Silence filled the room, heavy yet holy. The boy's tears slowed, his breathing steadied, and though his body remained still, something deep within him shifted. A seed had been planted, watered not with pity, but with truth. That night, long after the boy had fallen asleep, his father found the maid in the kitchen, her hands busy with the day's final tasks. He approached her, his voice low, almost reverent. "What are you doing to my son?" She paused, turning to meet his eyes. "I am not healing him," she said simply. "I am reminding him he can heal himself." The father, a man who had spent his life believing every problem could be solved by wealth, felt humbled in a way he had never known. He looked at this woman, this maid whose presence was altering the very fabric of their lives, and realized that what she brought could never be bought. And so he let her continue. The days that followed were unlike anything Richard had ever experienced in his household. For years, his mansion had been a fortress of wealth and silence, filled with priceless art, but devoid of genuine laughter. Now, however, something subtle began to stir within its walls. It was not sudden, like a storm breaking, but gradual, like the way dawn creeps into a darkened sky. Richard found himself lingering by doorways, watching his son with new eyes. The boy, though still frail, had begun to carry a spark in his gaze that had been absent all his life. It was a spark ignited not by doctors, not by expensive specialists flown in from across the globe, but by the quiet, steady presence of the maid, the woman he had once dismissed as just another employee. But beneath Richard's growing admiration for her lay a shadow of shame. For years he had thrown money at his son's condition, building his empire higher and higher as though wealth itself could buy a miracle. And yet here was someone with calloused hands and second-hand shoes, performing miracles with nothing more than her patience, her heart, and her unwavering belief. At night, Richard wrestled with his thoughts. He would retreat to his private study, pour himself a glass of whiskey, and stare into the amber liquid as though answers might surface there. Guilt gnawed at him. He wondered how many moments he had missed with his son. Moments when his presence, not his money, could have mattered most. And while Richard battled with his own conscience, the maid carried secrets of her own. Her name was Grace, though the family had barely asked. She moved with quiet efficiency, never demanding attention. But her eyes, those deep, weary eyes, carried the weight of untold stories. When she thought no one was watching, she would sometimes pause in the hallway, gazing out of the tall windows at the city lights, her lips moving in silent prayer. Other times, when she tucked the boy into bed, her touch lingered just a fraction too long, as though she was cradling someone she had once lost. One evening, as Richard stood in the doorway of his son's room, he caught it, a whispered name that slipped from Grace's lips as she smoothed the boy's blanket, a name foreign to the family, a name she uttered with the kind of ache that only comes from love torn away too soon. He didn't ask that night, but the curiosity burrowed deep into him, alongside the growing respect. Who was this woman who could inspire his son to try where all others had failed? And what had life taken from her to etch such sorrow into her face? The mansion's halls, once silent, now echoed with fragments of change. Richard, for the first time in years, began to eat dinner with his son, instead of locking himself away with business calls. He listened to Grace's gentle instructions as she encouraged the boy to shift his legs, to take hold of the wooden railing she had set near the staircase. He watched as his son grimaced, faltered, then steadied. And for the first time, Richard felt the sting of tears he had always buried beneath his pride. And slowly, beneath all the wealth and stone walls, Richard's own transformation began. He was no longer just a father with money. He was learning, painfully and humbly, to be a father with presence. Richard's curiosity grew until it pressed on him like a weight. He had spent his life prying into markets, stocks, and boardrooms, but never into people. Yet with Grace, silence no longer sufficed. One late evening, after his son had drifted into sleep, Richard lingered in the dimly lit hallway. Grace was folding linens in the quiet, her posture straight, her movements graceful despite her weariness. He approached carefully, not with the commanding tone of an employer, but with the hesitancy of a man stepping into unfamiliar ground. "Grace," he said softly. She turned, startled. "Sir?" Richard hesitated. Words caught in his throat. For once, he wasn't sure how to ask a question. "Earlier, I heard you whisper a name. To my son. Who was it?" Grace froze, her hands stilled on the linen, her eyes flicking down as though the ground itself might swallow her secret. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, and then her lips trembled. "It was Samuel," she whispered. The name hung in the air like a fragile glass. Richard waited. Grace's voice grew steadier, though every word was heavy with grief. "He was my boy, my only child. He would have been the same age as your son now, if life had been kinder." She swallowed hard, her eyes glistening though she fought to keep her composure. "Samuel was born sickly, frail from the start. I spent years in hospitals, nights without sleep, begging God to let him live. I worked jobs, cleaned houses, anything to afford his treatments. But in the end, it wasn't enough. Money couldn't save him. Nothing could. Her words cracked like porcelain. For a moment, she pressed her hands to her chest, as though to still the pain that never left. I lost him 5 years ago, she continued, her voice a trembling thread. Since then, every child I see, especially those who suffer, I can't help but see my Samuel in them. When I came here, when I met your son, I saw his smile, his struggle, and I swore, even if he wasn't mine, I would give him the love I couldn't give Samuel for longer. I would not let him fight alone. Richard stood speechless. His world had always been transactions, negotiations, power plays. But here stood a woman who had been stripped of everything and yet gave more love than he had ever known how to give. For the first time in years, Richard felt something shift inside him. Not the ache of guilt alone, but the stirring of humility. He had built skyscrapers, conquered markets. Yet here was Grace, who had lost all and still gave freely. Grace, his voice faltered, softer than he intended. I never knew. Grace forced a faint smile, though her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. You weren't meant to know, sir. My pain is mine to carry. But your son, he still has a chance. And I will fight for him, as I once fought for Samuel. I will not stop. Her words struck him harder than any boardroom defeat, and in that moment Richard realized something that money had blinded him to for years. Love, not wealth, was the true miracle his son needed. That night Richard could not sleep. He lay awake in his vast bedroom, the ceiling stretching endlessly above him, yet feeling more suffocating than the narrowest alley. Grace's words replayed in his mind. Samuel, her boy, gone too soon, yet alive in every ounce of devotion she poured into his son. He stared at the shadows cast by the chandelier, the silence of the mansion pressing on him like a judgment. For the first time, the silence wasn't lonely, it was condemning. All these years he had chased fortune as though it would fill the void left by his wife's absence, by the laughter that should have filled these halls. He had believed that money was love translated into form, the finest doctors, the best tutors, toys stacked to the ceiling. Yet in the softest truths Grace had spoken, he realized what he had been blind to. He had not been a father. He had been a provider, yes. But a father? A father sat by the bed at midnight. A father whispered courage when fear crept in. A father carried his child not with wealth, but with presence. Tears, hot, unbidden, blurred his vision. He pressed a hand to his face, ashamed yet unable to stop them. He, Richard Callahan, the unshakable titan of finance, was crumbling under the weight of his own neglect. In the morning, he did something no one in the household expected. Instead of leaving for the office in his polished suit and driver waiting, he carried a tray himself. Porridge, juice, and a slice of toast clumsily buttered. His son blinked in shock when Richard set it down. You made this? The boy asked, half in disbelief. Richard chuckled softly, though his throat tightened. Don't look so surprised. I wasn't always this bad at it. Your mother used to laugh at my burnt toast. The boy's lips curled into the faintest smile, and Richard's heart stirred. That smile was rarer than all his possessions combined, yet here it was, bought not with wealth, but with effort. Day by day, Richard tried again. He learned to sit at the bedside without fidgeting, to read stories aloud even when his voice cracked, to simply hold his son's hand in silence when words were too small for fear. Grace noticed, of course. She watched quietly, saying little, but the approval in her eyes was unmistakable. In those small acts, Richard felt his armor peel away. The hard shell of the executive gave way to something rawer, truer. For the first time in decades, he allowed himself not just to protect, but to feel. At night, when his son finally drifted off, Richard often lingered, watching the rise and fall of his child's fragile breath. He would glance at Grace, who sat knitting quietly, her face serene but shadowed with her own ghosts. And in those moments, Richard understood. This woman had carried more strength through loss than he had ever managed in abundance. Her devotion did not shame him. It called him higher. It was as if Samuel's spirit, through her, was teaching Richard how to love again. It began subtly. Richard no longer rushed out each morning with his phone pressed to his ear, barking instructions before he had even left the gates. Instead, he lingered in the kitchen, asking Mrs. Whitmore, the cook, how she was feeling that day, if her arthritis was troubling her joints. The first time he asked, she nearly dropped a spoon. Never in her 20 years of service had her employer spoken to her with such tenderness. When the groundskeeper, an older man named Ellis, was trimming the hedges, Richard paused on his way to the car. Instead of striding past with the dismissive nod he usually offered, he stopped, really stopped, and admired the handiwork. "You've kept these hedges finer than the gardens at any estate I've ever seen," he said. Ellis blinked, stunned, before muttering, "Thank you, sir." His voice trembled as though he'd been waiting his whole life to be noticed. At the office, the changes were even more startling. Richard had always been a figure of authority, commanding respect through presence alone, his employees fearing the weight of his silence. But now he sought them out, asked questions he had never asked before, not just about projections, mergers, or quarterly returns, but about families, about dreams. His assistant, Margaret, nearly dropped her pen when Richard asked, "How is your daughter settling into university?" She stammered a reply, her eyes wide as though trying to decide if this was some cruel test. But Richard only smiled, nodded, and listened. Truly listened. His gaze steady, his attention unbroken. In board meetings, the shift was even more pronounced. Where he once dismissed junior executives with a wave of the hand, now he leaned forward, inviting their voices. He began to notice the quiet ones, the overlooked analysts who scribbled notes on margins but rarely spoke. "What do you think?" he would ask, and the room would fall silent, stunned at the inclusiveness of the question. For some it was unnerving. They whispered in hushed tones, wondering if something was wrong, if their iron-willed CEO was ill. But for others, it was a revelation. They began to mirror his kindness, realizing that if the man at the top could bend, then so could they. At home, the staff felt it most keenly. No longer was the mansion ruled by the echo of commands. Instead, it pulsed with something unfamiliar. Warmth. Richard began eating in the kitchen some mornings, sharing toast with Grace and Mrs. Whitmore, laughing softly at stories of spilled flour or forgotten recipes. He sat with Ellis one afternoon, sipping tea while they watched the fountain spray sunlight into prisms. It was awkward at first. Servants were not accustomed to being equals, even briefly. But Richard's consistency chipped away at their caution. Slowly they began to respond, with stories of their own families, with laughter that rang through the halls. Grace, ever watchful, saw this transformation with quiet pride. She said nothing, but she knew. This was no performance, no guilt-ridden attempt to buy redemption. This was real. Richard was unlearning wealth's cruelest lesson. That distance equaled dignity. He was relearning humanity, one conversation at a time. And yet, as he grew gentler with those around him, the storm within him raged fiercer. For though he changed his habits, though he softened his voice, one question haunted him still. Was it too late? He could pour out affection now, could shower his boy with attention and Grace with gratitude. But the years lost, the birthdays missed, the tears left unattended, the nights when his son had asked for him and found only silence. Those years were a debt he feared could never be repaid. Richard carried that weight with him like a shadow, and perhaps it was that very weight that kept him moving, striving, desperate to show, to prove, that love could still grow in ground once left barren. It was a quiet evening, the kind that wrapped the mansion in velvet stillness. The boy had been laughing earlier, a rare sound that filled the rooms like sunlight breaking through clouds. Richard had sat at his bedside reading aloud from an old storybook, stumbling over the voices, earning a soft giggle from his son, the kind of sound he had once been too busy to notice. Grace stood in the doorway, watching, her heart pulled taut between joy and sorrow. For in the boy's eyes, bright though they were, there lingered a fragility no laughter could disguise. That night, as the household settled into slumber, the storm came. Richard woke to the sound of coughing, deep, racking, tearing coughs that did not belong to a child so young. He rushed down the hall, heart thundering, and found his son doubled over, gasping, his small body racked with pain. "Breathe, son. Please, breathe for me." Richard whispered, his hands trembling as he held the boy. Grace was there in an instant, calm though her own eyes glistened. She placed a hand on Richard's arm. We need the doctor. Now. The doctor arrived with urgency, the kind that spoke volumes without words. He examined the boy in silence, his brows knit, his lips pressed tight. Richard hovered, pacing like a man trapped in his own nightmare. Finally, the doctor spoke. His condition has worsened. The infection, it's spreading faster than expected. The room seemed to tilt. Richard gripped the bed frame to steady himself. What do you mean? You told me he had time. You said, I said we would monitor it, the doctor interrupted gently. But his lungs are weakening. We must act quickly if there's to be hope. The boy whimpered softly, reaching out with a frail hand. Richard took it, sinking to his knees beside the bed. His voice cracked, a sound alien to him. I'm here, son. I'm not leaving. Not this time. Grace laid a cool cloth across the boy's forehead, her movements steady, her touch tender. Yet inside, her heart pounded with a grief she had known before. The memory of another small hand she had once held, a child she could not save. She pushed the memory down, forcing her strength to the surface, for this boy needed her calm more than ever. As the night wore on, the boy's breathing grew shallow, each gasp a dagger in Richard's chest. He stayed there, whispering promises, his once manicured hands now clutching desperately, as though his grip alone could tether his son to life. In that room, wealth meant nothing. Influence meant nothing. Only love, raw and unguarded, filled the air. The household gathered quietly outside the door. Mrs. Whitmore, Ellis, the maids. They stood in silence, united in a vigil for the boy who had grown up in the shadow of grandeur, yet was more precious than any crown jewel. Inside, Richard broke. Please, he whispered into the dark, not to the doctor, not even to Grace, but to something higher, something he had long abandoned. Don't take him from me. Take everything else. Take it all. Just not him. Grace's eyes flicked toward him, and for the first time she saw not the tycoon, not the employer, but the father. A man stripped bare of pride, begging for the one thing money could never buy. And in that moment, she felt the old wound of her own loss burn anew. Yet instead of hardening her, it gave her strength. She leaned closer, her voice steady, low, and filled with a conviction she barely recognized as her own. He hears you, she said softly, but you must keep holding on. For him, for yourself. The boy stirred weakly, his lips parting to form a whisper, so faint it was almost lost. Dad? Richard's heart clenched. Yes, son, I'm here. Don't leave. Tears blurred Richard's vision. He pressed his forehead against his son's hand. Never again. I swear it. The monitors beeped in uneven rhythms, the doctor preparing what medicine he could. But in that moment, time itself seemed to hold its breath. The storm had broken. The mansion, once a monument of silence and pride, was now a battlefield of love and fear, where every soul inside held on to a single fragile hope, that the boy would see the dawn. The night stretched on endlessly. The boy's fragile breaths echoed in the hush of the sick room, each one like a candle flickering against the wind. Grace sat at his bedside, her hand resting gently over his small chest, as though her touch alone could coax strength back into him. Her lips moved in silent prayer, words she had whispered once before for a child she had lost. Richard, hunched and sleepless, refused to leave the room. His once pristine suit jacket lay crumpled over a chair, his tie discarded on the floor. His hair, usually combed with precision, hung loose across his forehead. He was no longer the untouchable tycoon. He was simply a father, broken, desperate, human. Downstairs, the staff kept vigil. Mrs. Whitmore brewed tea that went cold. Ellis polished silver just to keep his hands from trembling, and the maids huddled together in whispered prayers. For years, they had served in silence, invisible in the shadow of wealth. Tonight, they were family, united by love for the boy. As dawn's first pale light seeped through the curtains, the boy's breathing steadied. The doctor, exhausted, leaned back and whispered, "He's past the worst. If he makes it through the next few hours, he'll live. Relief broke over the room like sunlight after rain. Richard bowed his head into his hands, sobbing openly. Not the quiet tears of a man hiding weakness, but the raw, unguarded sobs of a father whose soul had been laid bare. Grace reached out, placing a steady hand on his shoulder. Their eyes met, hers filled with a compassion carved from grief, his brimming with gratitude so deep it needed no words. "Thank you," he whispered hoarsely. "It wasn't me," Grace replied softly, glancing at the boy. "It was him. He chose to fight." The boy stirred, his voice raspy but alive. "Dad!" Richard leaned close, clutching his son's hand. "I'm here. I'll always be here." And in that fragile moment, the walls Richard had built his life upon, pride, power, distance, crumbled for good. Weeks passed. The boy grew stronger, his laughter returning like a song rediscovered. The mansion, once suffocating in silence, now pulsed with life. Staff who had once walked quietly with downcast eyes now moved with ease, laughter echoing through the halls. Richard had opened the doors, literally and figuratively. He began joining them at the table, listening to their stories, learning their names. The boardroom, too, felt the change. Gone was the iron-handed tycoon. In his place stood a man who listened, who valued, who led with humility instead of fear. But perhaps the greatest change was within the household itself. One evening, Richard found Grace in the garden, her hands in the soil, tending flowers that bloomed in colors as fierce as her spirit. "You saved him," he said quietly. Grace shook her head. "No, Mr. Whitmore. I only reminded you what mattered." He hesitated, then asked the question that had long lingered. "The way you cared for him, it felt like more than duty, like you'd been here before." Grace's gaze fell to the earth. A long silence passed before she spoke. "I once had a child, a little girl. She was my world. But sickness took her from me before I could save her." Her voice quavered, but she did not look away. "When I saw your boy, I swore I wouldn't let another child slip away. Not if I had any strength left in me." Richard's chest ached. He reached out, his hand resting over hers. "You did more than save him, Grace. You saved me, too." For the first time in years, he felt light. Not because his wealth or empire had grown, but because his heart, long hollow, had finally been filled. The mansion was no longer a monument of silence. It was a home. A father once lost in pride had been reborn in humility. A maid carrying her own hidden grief had found healing in devotion, and a boy, fragile yet fierce, had bound them all together. In the end, the story was not about power, nor wealth, nor legacy. It was about love, raw, unguarded, and true. And as Richard watched his son laugh in the garden, with Grace smiling softly nearby, he understood the truth that had taken him a lifetime to learn. The greatest legacy a man can leave is not marble walls or golden halls. It is the love he nurtures, the lives he touches, and the family he builds. Not with wealth, but with heart. If you believe stories like this should be told, hit that subscribe button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and drop a comment below because your voice matters too.